afternoon. Welcome, everyone. Today, we are beginning our next meeting in the Explaining Ukraine format. It's a joint project by Media Center Ukraine and Tvoe Misto Lviv Independent Media Hub, and the purpose is to explain to global journalists and international media the context of Ukraine, the context of this war. And today we have a great, experienced, and creative speaker, Mr. Pavlo Hodimov. He is an artist, performer, musician, art manager. He is a modern art manager to start with. He's a collection expert, the founder of Ya Gallery. This gallery existed only in Kyiv, and then it was opened in Lviv as well. And he's also one of the ideologists behind the Heritage Bureau in Ukraine. So he's basically a person that knows a lot or almost everything about Ukrainian culture, in particular about Ukrainian art and modern art. Pavlo, recently, a week or two ago, Paris hosted a special event. The Eiffel Tower was illuminated in the colors of the Ukrainian flag, blue and yellow. And the Stefania song by the Kalush Orchestra Band was playing in the background. And before that, the National French Orchestra played the melody piece by Miroslav Skorik. I have heard from different international colleagues that it was an eye-opener for them. Some colleagues had known Skorik for a long time, so it did not really come as a surprise to them, but doesn't really mean that the Western world and Europe in particular are just beginning to discover Ukrainian culture and Ukrainian art. Thank you very much for this question. I would love to be in line with the criteria that you have outlined and know everything about Ukrainian culture. But if we're talking about Ukrainian culture in the context of Western civilization, the civilization of the US, Africa, Oceania, there are a lot of white spots there for me. I do know quite a bit where our diaspora is based, but I have no clue how it's correlated to the modern Ukrainian culture. Eastern and Western Europe include those countries that discovered Ukrainian culture quite a long time ago, but it was not really an in-depth discovery for them. It happened because they feel some sort of partnership, there's territorial proximity, and they come here from time to time with minor exhibitions, with concerts and performances. For example, Poland, the Czech Republic, Lithuania. I guess Lithuania is the most active one in terms of cultural exchange with Ukraine. If necessary, I can even illustrate specific examples, not to make just empty statements. But it's something much more in Western Europe. Mr. Zelensky gave a speech in Bundestag, and he said that there was a wall between us. I mean, it's clear which wall he was referring to, but let me emphasize that the wall before Ukraine, the way we know it, and the rest of the civilized world is still there. And it's not just the issue of the civilized world. This is our problem in the first place. Why? So what are some of our failures in this regard? Well, we do have some failures in the context of international relations, in the context of cooperation and diplomacy. All these things are just in the making right now. I mean, we are represented in international institutions. We're always represented at Biennale, like Venice Biennale. But in most cases, this representation is very scarce and meager and of poor quality. Fortunately, the situation with the Venice Biennale is much better. These are not really large public projects, but they are of high quality and they are not really contentious. As you know, this year, Pavlo Makov, a Kharkiv artist, represents Ukraine with the Aqua Alta painting. Aqua Alta, high water. What does it look like? Ukraine could have its own pavilion there, and Ukraine could have its ambitious spaces there. So it doesn't have to be just about renting a small space. So this is the problem. We do not pay for our projects. We ask others to pay for us. So it's like a lady that needs to be walked out. The world is not really at the pinnacle of its economic development. A lot of countries are experiencing a crisis. So they're asking themselves, why do we have to pay for Ukrainian projects? Why doesn't Ukraine want to be an active participant in this process? There's another important aspect that comes into play. We have our own perception of what we would like to demonstrate there, while Western Europe has a different understanding of what they would like to see. And if these two things are not correlated, then there is a discrepancy in view. So maybe we demonstrate those things that are secondary to them, that are not appealing to them, and we are setting ourselves up because in Western Europe, there is immense expertise with regard to modern art. So in the past almost 31 years, we have underperformed in terms of representation globally. I believe that this war is a great opportunity for the world to hear Ukraine, to see Ukraine, like see the Ukrainian flag and listen to the melody piece by Miroslav Skorik. It has to be about festivals. It has to be about the organization of ambitious weeks and even months of Ukrainian culture. But we should not really pursue the Russian model because Russia was very aggressive about incorporating its culture in the European society. But what can be of interest? You have referenced several formats, but what is the uniqueness of Ukrainian culture? What is so special about our culture? What can we share with the world? We will revert to the issue of Russia, but about Ukraine first. But this is something that Russia invested a lot of effort into. I watched a conversation with Irina Starovoyt yesterday, and she said that Bulhakov's and Pushkin's heritage vanished at a crossroads in Bucha. Well, we will go back to the issue of what Russia did to Ukrainian culture, but back to my initial question, what is the uniqueness of Ukrainian culture? What can we offer to the world? There are always several perspectives on our uniqueness. If you go to France, you will not see statements along the following lines. I mean, these statements will even be forbidden. So you will not really hear from the French statements along the lines of, our culture is unique. It's like making a pass, right? I mean, they just do a lot of work on their culture. They invest a lot in their culture. They make sure that they represent their culture in a proper way. And the consumers of French culture should understand its uniqueness. So it's not about this practice of the Soviet Union, the longest, the most beautiful, the unique, the biggest. To give an objective answer to your question, we would need to have a number of experts, cultural studies professionals from France, the Netherlands, Poland, Lithuania, maybe from Great Britain as well. So we need to expose them to Ukrainian culture the way it is. It's not about creating some sort of hybrid forms, because this is something that we often do for the West. we craft some hybrids, or we create something that we think is beautiful, but it's not really organic, it's not really natural. So if we do that, I think that most experts would be unanimous in their opinions. So they would see the originality of our art, of our theater. They would tell us who can be invited onto global stages. What about some of our accomplishments in the world of academic music? In my view, if we're talking about the information that I receive from European experts, they're always avidly interested in the following things: cinema, but not commercial Ukrainian cinema. No way. They are interested in creative, festival related pieces. And I believe that the beginnings of creative Ukrainian cinema are already there. Like My Thoughts Are Quiet movie, it became a sensation for Ukraine. To the best of my understanding, Lukic's last movie made it onto the list of the official Cannes Festival program next year. With regard to music, there is an interest in academic music in the first place because domestically, we significantly understate the potential of our academic music outside. In terms of popular music, there are a lot of borders here. Popular music is an expansion campaign that has to be undergirded by hefty investments. If we're talking about Kalush Orchestra, they blossomed in the context of the war because the entire world is very sensitive to the war in Ukraine. That's why Kalush Orchestra became the finalists, and otherwise they might not have been invited to Paris and other locations. But if we're talking about Ukrainian popular music, it can also be properly represented in the West on par with our academic music. Visual art. We can break it down into several sectors and directions. It's not only about modern art. The world gravitate towards things that help them track things down over time. They cannot understand modern traditions if they have no clue what happened in the 1920s, in the Soviet times, Ukrainian avant-garde, the art of the 1960s. We also have an entire tier of authors that were juxtaposed, or they were in juxtaposition to the system of Soviet socialism. So these are people from the 1960s that transitioned into the 1990s and then independent Ukraine, and they created a platform for the development of modern Ukrainian art. And we also have a wide array of contemporary Ukrainian artists. Mikita Kadan, Zhana Kadyrova. There are gallery curators from abroad that are interested in our artists. And this is a big thing. This is a watershed moment for Ukraine because they are represented at global fairs. In terms of theater, Vlad Troitsky is definitely in the lead here. His musical, his theatrical initiatives are incredible. He's very active. He creates performances in collaboration with European theaters. The world knows him. They do know him, but not sufficiently. So they need to know more about Vlad Troitsky, Daha Bracha. I believe that this cultural product enjoys much greater potential. It's like new opera. It's a mix of theater and music. I believe that new opera might become a sensational project for the global musical and theatrical community. We also have some other powerful composers, Silvestrov, and we're not even baffled by why they are enjoying popularity in the US, in Canada, in other countries, but we have very few people like Silvestrov. He's definitely unique, but we also have a generation of new composers emerging. These are budding composers that need to be integrated into this environment. So we basically need to help them, support them, guide them. That's what Sheptytsky did for artists. He helped them be represented in Paris, Prague, Krakow. Back to your question about potential, I cannot really be very objective in my assessment, but we have modern music, some cinema, theater. Believe me, the potential is there. The literary potential is also there. The book potential needs to be unleashed as well. Hrafka, for example, or the Starý Lev publishing house. How many books they sell by these authors. So graphic design, creativity. Well, there are some question marks about fashion. We need to keep in mind that fashion is a very complex sector because these are creative industries that require very narrow and specialized expertise. Well, it's one thing to say that this brand can become a global brand, but it's something different to promote this brand because that requires hefty investments. I believe that we need to create some sort of fund or foundation in Ukraine that would offer interest-free loans to creative industries. I believe that we need to do everything within our capacity for Ukraine not to miss out on these multiple opportunities because we don't want to be recognized only because of the war unraveling in Ukraine right now. We want to be recognized as a cultural country or as a cultural hub as well. My colleague, US journalist, said something a long time ago, like a year ago, even before this full-scale invasion. He traveled quite a bit around Ukraine, and he said that he felt immense potential for future explosion. Maybe he overstated this potential, or maybe not. Do you agree that the war exposed and surfaced what was hidden there for a long time? And this is something that we need to show to the rest of the world. I don't really want to talk about it theoretically. My last exhibition in Lviv was entitled Muses Cannot Be Silent. It's about art during wartime. That exhibition will still be there until mid-September in the Gunpowder Tower. And if you go there, you will see what is a driving force behind musicians, artists, performers. We cannot really squeeze the war art into the Gunpowder Tower, but still some bits and pieces are there. With regard to the quote by your US colleague, I can say the following thing. I've been conversing with international journalists quite a lot since the outbreak of the war, and this is something that I hear during each and every conversation. There's this special drive or vibe in Ukraine in the area of art. And this is a hallmark that we need to tap into both internally and externally. I'm engaged in some working groups on Ukraine's recovery at the Ministry of Culture, and I offered a number of projects that would allow us to capture this vibe, this drive, because even if this drive is there, we also need to factor in the reality of our daily life, shortage of funds. Everyone wants to sustain their families. And then we have this very selfish perspective on the part of the government. You continue working, and then we will just reap the fruits. So my point is that we need to review the system for supporting independent culture, among other things. Public culture is supported to a certain extent, while independent culture was abandoned. The Ukrainian Cultural Fund is not operational anymore. They basically donated all their funds for military purposes, and they did not raise sufficient funds to continue supporting this sector. We are facing a crisis now. So this drive has its limits, and this crisis might result in significant brain drain, and these people will be hailed and welcomed in Europe, America, and on other continents, and we will have to reap the fruits of our short-sightedness. The creative potential of any country is something that needs to be appreciated and cherished. This is the only thing that we can use to stand out and be discernible. I don't think that we can be an equal rival with the Silicon Valley. I don't really think that our agrarian sector is of interest to Europe. I mean, from a resources perspective, it is interesting, but we can be appealing by dint of our creativity, culture, and even our approaches to this war. I'm 100% certain that we need to give thought to how we can monetize this drive, how we can do it abroad. We also need to do our utmost to motivate creative people to stay in Ukraine and work for the good of our economy. And there's another must be here. This is my stance as a Ukrainian citizen. So I referred to my participation in the working group at the Ministry of Culture, and I proposed 3 things. So we need to initiate a Ukrainian culture conference, which will intend to communicate not only our problems, but also our accomplishments. So it's all about internal communication within creative communities. We also need to set up modern culture centers supported by the government. So you have the center, you have people, and you need to support these centers from a financial and cultural perspective. And the third thing is that we need to finalize the decommunization process. It's a principal thing that we have to do. We need to shut down that red door, if I can put it this way. But it's not really about some formalities, dismantling 1 or 2 monuments. Because even if we do that, the system might remain intact. We have some regulations and decrees dating back to Stalin's times. Some of the things were initiated back in the 1960s, 70s, 80s. It's unfathomable. We need to review our culture sector. We need to evaluate its effectiveness. So this trident on the Motherland Ukraine monument, this is not something that we need to be concerned about right now, right? Well, these are some things that create a lot of hype. Well, you remember that they put a wreath on the head of this Motherland Ukraine monument. But what's the gain for us if we topple down this monument? What's the gain for us if we do some other formal things? We need to start from within. I believe that most Soviet monuments, social realism, some propagandist monuments, well, you remember my cooperation with the Lviv ceramic factory. I mean, we just need to move everything to a museum. We have a beautiful museum of terror in Ukraine. They dismantled this monument on Striska Street and they moved it there. But we need to dig deeper. We need to understand the genesis of this fifth column, the roots of the Soviet propaganda system, how the lie and propaganda system operates. I do understand that the ripples of all these things are still within us. So we need to debunk and break the mold of all these things. We need to explain it to Ukrainians, and we also need to debunk some of the stereotypes propagated by Russia, because they have this typical playbook that they've been using for a long time. Ms. Olinik, a music studies expert, states that Russia has been stealing our culture for a long time. For example, some Ukrainian musicians were called Russian even though they were born in Lviv. And this is something that we can see based on the example of Bortnyavsky, Berezovsky. They were taken to St. Petersburg a cappella, and they had to work for the needs of the Tsar family. And there were even two premieres by these Ukrainian composers in Europe, but the world knows nothing about it. So can we revert to the times of the Russian Empire? How was Russia trying to destroy Ukrainian culture? Well, how has it been doing all this time? But is it about destruction or being nurtured by Ukrainian culture? Ukrainian culture has always been quite dangerous. It was dangerous for the Russian Empire, so they wanted to either assimilate it, to make it their own, to belittle this small nation, because the culture is a testimony of the high level of development. So if there is culture, then you cannot really dub this nation a false nation or a synthetic nature. Ukrainian people have always been very creative. If we're talking about systemic approach, believe me, during many years of resistance, Russia utilized a toolkit of tools implying bans, for example, Russification, a ban on Ukrainian language book publishing. And you said that they were prone to take our culture away. Well, let's keep in mind that St. Petersburg was the capital of the Russian Empire, and creative people were invited there. Let's remember Taras Shevchenko's story. There was a reason for it. I mean, he would not be able to unleash his potential here, but it happened there. So basically, he was offered favorable conditions for creative work. Kasyan remembers that Shevchenko was dubbed Russian Rembrandt in Russia. But this Russian Rembrandt was Ukrainian in each and every fiber of his being. And he continued cherishing this dream of being back in Ukraine. But how did it happen? Intelligentsia purchases, people in power pressurize. So, and if the situation is out of control, they imprison, they incarcerate, they prosecute. I would not want Ukraine to be viewed as a lame country. Believe me, Russia did a lot to achieve that. When Kotlяревsky wrote his Aeneid, what about Pushkin, Dostoevsky? What were they doing? Aeneid was one of the first pieces, Ukrainian pieces, created on the territory of the Russian Empire, but published in St. Petersburg, in the capital. But it was recited in Poltava, in Lviv, in St. Petersburg, in Moscow, because that language was clear. Well, now you hear from the Russians, we do not understand Ukrainian, but back then they did understand. By the way, if we have a look at the modern Russian language, we will still find a lot of Ukrainian words there, because the language was being forged here, and then some Turk words were added as well. So when we were talking about Shevchenko, there was this issue about Shevchenko and Pushkin within one volume, but that was much later. Shevchenko was recited in the original language because it was a robust cultural piece. I'm not even talking about his carved work, because basically he did rethink Rembrandt's art. So he was an artist and a poet, and he's one of the major symbols for Ukraine. So this is something that was used by the Soviet authorities, Lesya, Franco, but certain filters were applied. Well, we all have our own filters. All epochs apply filters, and we're doing the same now. So when we are saying that we need to rethink all this, that we need to demonstrate how esteemed these people were. Last year, I managed the project entitled Lesa Ukrainka, 150 names. It was a completely different perspective on Lesa. Lesa as something intimate, it's something close. Her journeys were depicted as her Instagram, the places that she visited, her statements, her direct speech, her biography. So these are European people. Where did Lesa publish her first books? In Lviv, not there, because it was not allowed there. Ivan Franko was her producer, basically. So when we're talking about Ukraine's unity from a cultural perspective, it's been unified for a long time. There were some territorial challenges and setbacks, and it's one of the reasons behind this war. Horrendous Russification, hideous propaganda that was imposed on entire regions. And this is something that led not just to loyalty, but also confrontation with Ukrainian culture. My grandfather told me that in the 1930s, Kharkiv was a Ukrainian-speaking language. Mayakovsky would go there and speak Ukrainian. I mean, his Ukrainian was quite poor, but since he was in Ukraine, he felt compelled to speak Ukrainian. And now let's remember Okan Elze. This is my experience. You have concert halls, stadiums, and young Russians were singing Ukrainian songs in Ukraine. We're talking about thousands, tens of thousands, maybe even millions. When we are talking about the impact of Ukrainian culture on Russia, popular culture, elitarian culture, it's gigantic, it's just colossal. And if this ugly policy had not continued, we would have had an enormous impact on Russia. And I guess in terms of creativity, we would be in the lead. I don't really want to disclose all the ins and outs of our first triumph in Russia. I'm referring to Okan Elze, but we know the high level of our performance. I don't really want to critique anything or anyone, but it's clear why there was this divine attitude towards Ukrainian music in Russia. Because they didn't have anything of the sort in their own country. We always felt regard for Lapis Trubetskoy and Brutto because it's a top-notch, high-quality product. And we didn't really care that this product was generated by the Belarusians. We would attend their concerts. When we are saying that Ukraine boasts enormous impact potential. This is the potential that has already been unleashed. The Gudimum album was released in Russia back in 2007. That was our last album. And there was a decree by the State Oversight Agency of Russia to impose a ban on Ukrainian language music. That was back in 2010. And all recording companies severed their cooperation with Ukrainian bands or requested them to shift to the Russian language. And I said, I'm sorry, but no. Back to your question. So we can even initiate a large-scale, nuanced conference. I hate it when Ukrainians themselves belittle our own culture and say something along the lines of, what do we do next to this great Russian culture? Well, I'm really sorry, but this great Russian culture and our great Ukrainian culture coexisted for a long time. And it's true indeed that Ukrainian culture nurtured and nourished Russian culture. So we need to be sober and objective in our thinking, and we need to understand who we view as part and parcel of our culture. Well, what was the location of Malevich's exhibition, last Malevich's exhibition in Kyiv? And he wrote a letter saying, please purchase at least a few pieces because I'm terminally ill and I don't really want to have them back. But if we had purchased 10 or 15 pieces, we would have a Malevich Museum in the city of Kyiv. So we need to rethink our own perspective on Ukrainian culture. Malevich's last exhibition took place in Kyiv for a reason. So what you've just said means that Ukrainian culture might have positively impacted the Russians. That's the way it was. It's always been like that. And it's a huge problem. We will not be able to erect really high walls because the media space is there. But we need to understand how we can have a positive impact. We have this aggression, and this is aggression that is replete with myths and horrific stories in Russia. So this is a natural human response manifested in the form of aggression. But let's fantasize. Let's assume that we have a completely different cohort of people in power, and they will say, we want to repent. Of course, we will view this repentance with a pinch of salt, but we need to change and transform our links. And here I'm referring to the language of culture. I would even put it in a different way. We need to be more ambitious. Because if we are ambitious, we will exude dignity. And if dignity is there, there will be more respect from the aggressor and even those countries that are supportive of us, because dignity is about culture. You referred to Okan Elze's concert in Russia, 2018, that's what I remember. The war was already ongoing, and there was a concert by Okan Elze in Odessa, and I bumped into Boris Nemtsov. He was still alive there, and I think he was wearing an embroidered national Ukrainian shirt. Back to the issue of the war. About a week or two ago, we had the president of the Architectural Association from France, Martin Duplantier, and he expressed a very interesting opinion. So Russia is decimating monuments, museums, and churches, and this is something that Russia is doing deliberately and consciously to annihilate Ukrainian identity, to level us, to silence us. And it's directly linked to what you were talking about. Culture is telling, culture is eloquent, culture is very expressive. So they are destroying our culture because they want to silence us. It's a poorly effective method, to be honest. Our culture is not as primitive as they might think. So our culture is not only about some architectural monuments or museum exhibits, but I'm sure that most of these museum exhibits were evacuated a long time ago. It's a different type of culture. Culture is within us. This is like this spring with living water. And to annihilate us, you need to do what they did back in 1937. So you need to bring together hundreds and hundreds of culture figures, take them to Gulag and murder them there. That will be a serious wound. But by destroying buildings, they're just exposing their negligence and ignorance. Ukrainian culture is very mobile and dynamic. We have the Kharkiv Academy of Design and Arts. This academy relocated to Lviv and is cooperating with the Lviv Arts Academy. So it's a normal, modern model. I think that owing to this war, we will network even more. We are paying a high price indeed, but I guess this price is justified because we are immensely warm and gentle people, especially people of culture. The latter understand the value of one another. They can destroy physical infrastructure, but this is not the right technique to be utilized. It's not effective whatsoever. Well, maybe this guy from France conjures up some other images in his mind, Louvre and acts of terror concentrated, but we don't really have these things concentrated in Ukraine. Everything is scattered around, which is to our benefit. This threat will be there for many years to come. So we need to give thought to what we're going to do with our museum potential. We lost Malevich in the past, and the same holds true of other workers. Yana Klitschko, an arts expert, states that we need to give thought to how we can return those things that were stolen from us by Russia. This is something that they did in the Soviet times and even after the collapse of the Soviet Union. We need to be ambitious, but when I'm talking about ambitions, I mean healthy ambitions, not imperial ambitious, not sick ambitions. We need to be sober, we need to be lucid in our minds, but we need to know our worth. Because if you are not sure what you are worth of, then you will be struggling. Well, it's not about destroying Ukrainian culture in the same way as they are destroying our energy infrastructure, army, physical buildings. Culture is this living spring that will always be there. It's like with the ground waters, they're always there. It's like a fountain. I'm referring to Skovoroda here. Moreover, people might attempt to destroy culture and it will become even more powerful. There will be even more of this culture, and this is something that I'm already observing. Some unimportant and minor cultural things have already vanished into thin air. People have a clear understanding of their cultural and national identity. There's no social realism here anymore. No one will order banners or posters on the topic of our victory or like patriotic movie. People do understand that it's all about creating high quality products. But once again, we need to do it from a healthy citizen perspective with due regard for other citizens. we also need to appreciate our audience, because that appreciation is not there yet. We have an amazing audience. Our people are very passionate about culture. They have a special predilection for culture. In these dire times of the war, we have seen a cultural growth, and we can see the mindset of cultural figures changing. Well, but that growth is not present everywhere. This entire situation pertaining to the war galvanized some people into action, while others are in the zone. They're sort of frozen and numb, and they cannot really engage in creative work. So a lot of people are still trying to adjust it to this new reality. There are some people of culture that state directly that they cannot engage in creative work. They cannot really do that because of all the horrors of the war, all the killings, all the atrocities. All these things drain them, because this aggression targets different groups of population. Creative industries are very sensitive and vulnerable, because it's all about suffering for them. And for some people, suffering serves as a source of growth, while for others, it's a source of silence. But once this thing is over, this silence might transform into something very powerful. So when we are talking about diverse approaches to culture, when we're talking about the dynamics of the cultural community, any war can give an enormous impetus. So you might have this silence at first, but then there will be this amazing drive and vibe in the end. I can already see it. To finish it off, I would like to raise the issue of cultural diplomacy. We had Miroslav Maranovic and Bogdan Techolos as our speakers at one of the recent events. And there was a question from a Japanese journalist. He said, well, I've come here, I've traveled throughout Ukraine, I've been to Kharkiv, Kyiv, Lviv, and on the way to Ukraine, I had my own stereotypes about your country. I thought that you were completely different peoples, or even nations, if I can put so. That you were people with diverse interests. But having traveled around Ukraine, I've realized that you were the same in Lviv, Kyiv, Kharkiv. What is this uniting force? Shared bread, shared territory, or shared language? And he was taken aback when he heard the answers of our both speakers. None. It was all about shared values, values of dignity and freedom. Can we use culture to explain Ukraine in a better way to the rest of the world? Can we employ culture to respond to the world why Ukrainians are unrelenting, why they are not giving up, and why we put freedom first? The tradition of freedom is so deeply grounded in our history that we cannot even properly analyze it. When we're talking about this genome of freedom, it's part and parcel of our mindset or mental design. I would put it in the following way. Apart from shared values and this gene of freedom, we are also united by this aspiration for a good life here and now. We don't really want to postpone it until the next generation. I think Mr. Budin wrote about it. He elucidated the difference between a Russian village and a Ukrainian village. So you come to Ukraine, you see these neat white houses, you meet these handsome and tidy men in embroidered shirts, beautiful women, happy and joyful children. So it's all about this desire for a good life here and now, dignified life. So it's not just about values and this striving or longing for freedom. It's part and parcel of our dignity, and we're not really ready to change it for anything. We don't want to change it for cheap Russian gas or some fake promises and pledges by some other partners of ours. In the past 31 years, especially in the past 8 years, we have realized that a lot is contingent on us. And we basically determine the attitude of our overseas partners towards us. Culture is a solid tool that we can utilize to help our partners have a glimpse of our power and strength. And this is something that we have not seen since World War II. I mean, there was nothing of the kind during World War II. We have this hybrid phenomenon in the making right now, and this is something that will be explored in the future. As for communication, we will have 2 exhibitions in Vilnius. Well, the first one will be entitled Prostory, Spaces, a large-scale exhibition by 5 Ukrainian artists, Yanovich, Saihadovsky, Malishka, Portro Moldavanov. They all represent different regions of Ukraine, but they all will be united within the same space. So this is something that people can feast their eyes on. And another exhibition, Old and New Craftsmen, from Kharkiv and from Lviv. Well, people are attentive. They have an eye for detail. They read who is from where. And my point is that culture can be a good manifestation of our level of development, our level of values, dignity. If we invested enormous efforts not to recover or reconstruct, we just need to develop our country in a different way. And we should not really wait until our victory. We need to already start rectifying our mistakes. And culture will play a crucial role here. Believe me, in 100, 200, or 300 years, historians will rewrite and rethink a lot of things, but culture and art will stay forever until the end of our mankind. And people will use all these creative pieces to glean philosophical insights. Therefore, we need to do everything within our capacity to cherish our culture, to preserve it. We need to be cultural watchdogs, but we should not be isolated. We must be open like we must be open to the world. Not only like Lviv, but like Ukraine recently as well. Nowadays, we are communicating powerful messages to the world about Ukraine. This is something that was lost in the past, but now we have Ukraine on the front pages of newspapers and media outlets. But hopefully, it will not be only about negative messages. Hopefully, the world will want to find out more about different tiers that we have in our country, including culture. Thank you very much for this conversation. I really hope that it has elucidated the essence of Ukrainians and why it's important to preserve and further develop Ukrainian culture. You briefly talked about the prospects of our culture during the war, after the war, when we obtain our victory. Well, I really hope that this victory will come as soon as possible. And I really hope that you all, people of culture, will have a lot of work on your plates. Well, you will definitely have a lot of work after our victory, but there are a lot of things that you can already do now. Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Taras, for superb moderation, and I'm very grateful to each and everyone who watched us today. Just a reminder that we had a joint meeting organized by Media Center Ukraine and Tvoe Misto Lviv Independent Media Hub, and the purpose is to communicate detailed information about Ukraine and the context of the war to international journalists. Stay tuned. Hope to see you soon.